The contract you just downloaded for free was written for every business, and that's the problem. A free template contract covers you about as well as a boilerplate disclaimer, which is to say, not really that well. Business owners will sometimes lose lawsuits that they should have won, and sometimes that results from a free or low-cost template contract with their customer when they should have used something a little bit better. Have you ever wondered what your budget DIY customer contract covers and what it doesn't? Well, I've got a little bit of info for you today. Hi, I'm Dustin Lee. I'm the founding attorney of Ascend Legal Solutions. We're a business law firm based out of Texas, handling all types of business legal issues. Everything in this video is educational and informational purposes only. It's not any sort of advice. It's not legal advice, tax advice, securities advice, financial advice, or any other kind of advice. If you need advice about your particular set of facts and circumstances, you need to contact a lawyer in your jurisdiction. Also, watching this video does not create an attorney-client relationship. In this video, you are going to get a straightforward breakdown of what goes into most customer contracts, where templates usually fall short, things that you need to be thinking about when you're having the discussions with these customers, the differences between a generic templated or budget DIY contract versus something that's a little bit more thorough. And if you stay to the end, I'll also talk a little bit about how the AI arena is making an impact on this as well. Most businesses think about their customer contract as just a formality or something that needs to be checked off. And in fact, that's a very expensive and problematic way to think about it. A lot of times people are just using a verbal or handshake agreement with their customers. Obviously, a DIY template or a budget contract is probably, not always, but probably going to be better than just your handshake agreement. However, the budget or DIY agreement still usually doesn't cover everything that it needs to cover for your business. So what's the job of the contract? The job of the contract is to cover the relationship between the parties and clearly and accurately spell out all of the details of the relationship and how the transaction is going to occur. So think about what's being delivered, how much, when, who bears the risk of the transport, what's the price? How's the price paid? When is it paid? All of these sorts of things. The DIY or budget contracts may cover the basics, but they don't really cover everything that's going to be in the relationship between you and your client. Now, why do most business owners treat this as more of a formality than anything else? It's usually because, oh, we've never had a problem before, or we've never had to deal with that before. A lot of times we're just too busy, we're too much in a hurry, we just want to get the deal done and we want to get on down the road. The contract, it's getting in the way of that a little bit. In actuality, the contract is there to protect you and even to protect the other side, to make sure that everyone has very clear expectations going into the relationship, what's going to happen. So what does a well-drafted contract do for you? Something that these budget or template contracts normally don't, is it's going to govern and it's going to set the expectations of that relationship on every single point up front so that there's no issues down the road. And if there are issues down the road, it's very clearly covered in the contract. So you can kind of think about it like this. Do you want your contract to be just another piece of paper that gets shoveled into a drawer somewhere, or do you want it to be something that is actually protecting your business? Now let's talk about some actual contract terms, some things that go in your contract, the most important things to have in there, but also where do DIY or budget templates fail? A lot of times customer disputes and things that end up in litigation, they don't actually start with bad intentions. They start with a poorly drafted contract that doesn't actually describe the scope of the work being done. Now, your budget or DIY contract is usually going to have a very generic scope clause, something that doesn't actually talk anything about the arrangement that you really have with your customer, and that can be a big problem. Scope disputes start because there is vague or missing language about the scope. The vague or incomplete language makes it to where each side has different expectations and there's not really even a meeting of the mind on the scope. Maybe you had envisioned to deliver A, client had envisioned that you would deliver A, B, and C, and it wasn't clearly defined in the scope. Well, now we've got a problem. Neither one of you is lying, it's just that you had different expectations. So what does a clear scope look like? A clear scope is going to have very detailed information about exactly what you're delivering, whether it be products or services. And that information actually also can include exclusions, things that you will not be delivering. So you want to be very precise and descriptive in what you're going to be delivering, but also you can exclude things. You could do revision limits, you could do timelines, or for example, like in construction or other industries where there are frequent changes to the scope of the project, how do we do change orders? Must they be signed? How do they get approved? And so on and so forth. So what do budget or DIY templates typically do here? They typically just leave a little blank for you to fill in the scope of work or what's going to be provided. They don't provide you any guidance on how to actually craft a scope provision like this to prevent scope creep or to prevent disputes about the scope of work. Also, they usually don't give you guidance about what should be excluded from your scope of work. So if your contract doesn't define what done actually looks like, you and your client may be working in two separate directions. All right, how about payment terms? Well, late payments, they're not just a business problem, usually they're a contract problem. What should payment terms discuss? Well, obviously payment terms should discuss the price, but also when is payment due? How should payment be made? To whom should payment be made? Who's authorized to make payments? Who's authorized to receive payments? Is it going to be a deposit or a retainer structure? Are there going to be milestone or progress payments? What triggers a late payment, or what happens if one occurs, or what happens if there's no payment at all? So if your budget template says net 30, what does that really mean? Because that's just barely your starting point on payment terms. How about late fees and attorney's fees? Most of the time, you're going to want to build in an incentive for your customer to pay timely. And the timely payment incentive is usually going to be some sort of late fee, attorney's fees for collection, litigation costs, things like that. And a lot of times your budget templates are not including things like that. So what do templates do well? The templates on the payment terms usually do include a payment term, but that's about where it ends. Most of the time, your budget templates are not addressing things like deposit requirements, retainer requirements, progress payments. What happens if no payment is made? What happens if a late payment is made? A lot of times they're not going to talk about if you have the right to suspend work if there's been no payment, or what happens if you do suspend the work. All these provisions give you leverage, and it gives your client an incentive to pay. If you don't have them, it makes it less likely that you're going to get paid. Now, how about termination? Every customer relationship usually has an endpoint. Whether or not that endpoint is clearly defined is going to be determined by your contract. I'll tell you right now, in my practice, this is one of the biggest ones, where somebody brings in a budget, a DIY, or a contract that they drafted themselves, or they just pulled off the internet. Most of the time, they don't have anything that addresses termination. In fact, I've seen a lot of contracts drafted by attorneys that don't even mention termination. So what would a termination clause usually cover? It's going to determine when is one side or the other side allowed to terminate the contract and for what reasons. It's also going to determine, are you required to send a notice first? Sometimes maybe you're going to be required to send a notice first if the termination is for no reason at all, but maybe you don't have to send a notice if there's a termination for cause. Or maybe you have to send a notice either way. Maybe there's an auto renewal of the term and you can only terminate at a certain time. So your termination clause isn't really about expecting a problem to happen. It's about figuring out what happens if a problem does arise and how does one party or the other terminate and what requirements there are surrounding that termination. Another big one that I see a lot in my practice is dispute resolution. A lot of times these budget, DIY, and self-drafted contracts have no dispute resolution provision in them whatsoever. What happens if you and your customer have a dispute and you can't agree on terms? Well, now you're leaving in the hands of the judge for the jury, and that can be an expensive answer to get. Okay, so what are your options? Typically, there's a few options. Number one is mediation. It's sort of a non-binding informal settlement process that you use a mediator to try to reach an agreement between the parties. There's arbitration. It's more like a full formal lawsuit, but tried to an arbitrator, usually someone like an experienced lawyer or a former judge that will make a final determination on your case. So it's very similar to a bench trial if you're in litigation. And the third option, obviously, is litigation. So that's your traditional lawsuit filing in which you could have a bench trial with the judge or a jury trial with the jury. Most of the time, your self-drafted DIY or budget template contracts aren't addressing what the dispute resolution procedure is. So what happens if your contract is silent as to a dispute resolution mechanism? Well, then your traditional state law is going to apply. You're going to have a lawsuit that's either charged to a judge or a jury, and all of the normal rules of procedure and evidence are going to apply in that case. But things that you don't think about that normally would go into even a dispute resolution or litigation type of clause in an agreement is a venue provision. Where does the lawsuit have to be filed? What laws are going to be used with respect to that lawsuit? What kind of cost structure is there going to be? And is there going to be any shifting of attorney's fees or other costs? These are things that you might include even if you're going to use the traditional lawsuit route as your dispute resolution mechanism. So your dispute resolution procedure is going to determine how expensive your dispute resolution gets. Is it going to be covered by your contract, or is it going to get really expensive down at the courthouse? Other things that your budget, DIY, and template contracts typically leave out, they're going to leave out things like limitation of liability, liability caps, representations and warranties, indemnification clause, insurance, risk allocation. The list goes on and on. So as you can tell, a free template, a budget template, a DIY contract that you did yourself, these are all things that are meant to sort of cover any business and any transaction, not to cover your business and your transaction. And that's where it falls short. So what can a basic template do? Well, it can cover the basic contract terms, almost like a term sheet or letter of intent. It doesn't do a good job of protecting you outside of that. So is it better than a verbal or handshake agreement? Usually, but not always, because the terms written down on paper are what's going to be enforced. So if your handshake agreement is different than what's on the paper, that actually may be worse for you. So it's really important that what goes on the paper is what the agreement actually is. And that's where the budget DIY template contracts typically fall short. Now, how about AI? Because that's been the new thing in the last couple of years. People have started to rely on AI for their legal work more and more. It's really the topic of a whole video, I'd say. But to give you a short rundown, AI like ChatGPT, or Gemini, Grok, Claude, those things are going to be highly dependent on who is actually prompting it as to the output that you're going to get. I've seen LLM output, AI output be better than template contracts, but still not that great. I've actually seen it be worse than template contracts because the output from your AI is only as good as your input. If your input is bad, if you don't know how to draft a contract, if you don't know what you're doing with respect to prompting the AI to draft your contract, you may actually get a worse contract than your budget template that you could have bought for a couple of bucks on the internet, and certainly way worse than if it was drafted by a professional business law attorney. And I've had plenty of clients, even sophisticated clients, who know what they're doing and sort of know how to prompt AI, bring in contracts that were drafted by AI. They're definitely better than the templates that I've seen, but they're still not as good as what the professional, seasoned business law attorney is going to output. On your very best day, it may get you 60–70% of the way there. This is one of those you don't know what you don't know situations. The AI tool can only take the inputs that you give it, and if you don't give it the right inputs about all the things that we've been talking about in this video, then you're not going to get the right outputs. So when do we move beyond DIY template budget contracts or asking AI to draft it for you? Well, I'm a lawyer. I'm going to tell you that every contract needs a lawyer to look at it because that's the absolute best option. Now, sometimes the budget or the timing may not allow for an attorney to take a look at it, and that's totally understandable. But I would say the more complex a deal is, the more relevant a deal is to your overall business financial picture. If it's a significantly larger deal than normal, if it's going to be a critical contract for you to have, these are all indicators that maybe you should get a lawyer involved. Another key indicator that maybe you should get a lawyer involved is that you've had difficulty in collecting from your clients. Let's say you have significant difficulty with clients not paying their bills. It could be because your contract's not drafted that well. So all in all, whether you're looking at the budget templates, if you're looking at AI, if you're looking at a lawyer, really the bottom line is the contract that best protects your business is the contract that knows your business and knows the transaction. So what did we cover today? Well, we covered what is the contract and why it is important to have certain things included. We covered the differences between a DIY contract versus having AI work on your contract or having a lawyer work on your contract. We covered some of the key things to have in your contract, but again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's actually more. When you sit down with a lawyer to have a contract design meeting, they'll actually go over with you all of the things that they think may be included in your contract. So if you take away nothing else, just realize that the template or the AI output is just the starting point. It's the point where you've just got the absolute bare bones basics. You really need to build on it from there with a complete understanding of your business and of the transaction that you're entering into. And obviously your customer contracts are only one key piece of your contract's picture, and they're only one key piece of your risk exposure. So if you have a business and you're worried about potential risk exposure, we've got another video that you can take a look at. Thanks, y'all.